Hi, I'm Ali Hussain, creator of Entmorph, and in this video we're going to explore state variables and reactive user interfaces. I'm going to show you how to create this component using the Entmorph component editor introduced in the components overview video. We're going to build on the fundamentals covered in that video, so if you haven't seen it already, it's a good idea to watch it first. You can find it either by going to entmorph.com or to the YouTube channel provided at the end of this video. The component we're going to create has a table with a number of controls, which let you modify the X and Y position and the radius of the circle below. To create this, I'll first switch to another tab with my Entmorph home screen loaded, and I'll also put the browser into full screen mode. From my home screen, I'll click on Create New Project. For the project name, I'll enter Introducing Components, Reactivity, and press Enter to create it. This creates an empty project. I'll scroll down to the namespace commands and click on Add Component, which creates a component cell. I'll rename the default ID from component 0 to SVG circle component and press Enter to accept it. Since we're going to cover state variables, we'll start with the state section, which is where we create state variables. There's already a state variable called state var, which is created by default. I'll click on it and rename it to X and press Enter. And I'll also change the initial value. So I'll click on nil and select number and give it the number 250 and press Enter. In the render section, we want to create a table element with a number of controls. I'll open the div element editor and scroll down to the element children panel. I'll click on Add, select HTML element, and type table for the tag and press Enter. This creates a table element which has a t-head and a t-body element. We don't need the head, so I'll select it and press delete to remove it. In the table body, there's a default row with 2 empty cells. We want to add 2 input elements to this row, 1 to each cell. So I'll open the first cell for editing, and I'll scroll down again to the element children. This time, instead of clicking on Add, I'll click Add Input, which opens the Add Input sub-menu. From here, I'll select number, and this creates an element with a tag of input/number. This is an Entmorph enhancement to HTML, and is a shortcut for an input element with its type attribute set to number. You can do this for any type of input element, and we'll see more examples as we go along. It also creates a default set of attributes for the element, which are represented as a map. We want to update the value attribute, so I'll click on its value, which opens an attribute value dropdown. The item we're interested in is @reactive, which when I click on it, opens another dropdown, giving us a choice of variables defined in the state section above. I'll select X, which sets the value of the value attribute to @X. Finally, I'll change the max attribute from 200 to 500. Within the next table cell, we want to add another input element. So I'll open it, scroll down to the element children, and click on Add Input again. This time I'll select Range, which adds an element with a tag of input/range. Again, I'll update the value attribute from nil to reactive and select X, and the max attribute from 200 to 500. If I click on Go To, Render, it takes us back up to the top of the render section. If I then close the root div editor, this closes all the open editors within it, and we can see the user interface design much more clearly. Now we're ready to build our component. Click on Go To and Run to take us to the Run panel of the component cell. If I click on Build Component, you'll see the output panel becomes populated with a number of items, including a test component panel. If I click on the Preview Component button within the test component panel, it populates the dashed area below with how the component will look to our users. And this is what we specified in the render section above. The input elements are rendered as a number box and a range slider respectively. This of course is just standard HTML, but if I click and hold down the mouse button on the up arrow inside the number box, not only does the number box update, but the range slider also moves to reflect the value in the number box. And if I move the range slider, the number box updates to reflect the value of the range slider. Now this isn't how HTML works. If we had to replicate this in HTML and JavaScript, even if we used a framework, in most cases we would need to add event handlers to the input elements. But since we haven't added any event handlers to our component, the question is, how does this work? You've probably guessed that this is because we set the value attribute of each input element to @x. And if you had, you'd be absolutely right. This is another Entmorph enhancement to HTML, and probably the most important one. By setting the value attribute of an input element to @x, we're effectively connecting that element to the x state variable, so that when a user interacts with that element, it updates x. It also creates a connection from x back to each element, so that whenever x is updated, all elements connected to it update. This explains why updating one input element also updates the other one, even though we didn't add any event handlers. So far, we've only looked at setting an @reactive as the value of the value attribute for input number and input range elements. Let's look at a couple of other places where we can add @reactives to the render section. Going back to the table, we'll add a cell at the end of the row. So scroll up, open the row, and from the element children, I'll click on Add TD to add a new cell. From its element children, I'll click on Add and select @reactive and select X. Now I can close that. This is an example of setting an @reactive as a child of an HTML element. Let's go back up to the render section, close everything, and I'll collapse the table and open the div element. And click on Add. And now below the table, we'll add an element with the tag of SVG. Press Enter. I'll accept the default attributes, and from the SVG element children, I'll click on Add and select SVG element this time, and give it a tag name of circle. And this creates a circle element with a default set of attributes. For the CX attribute, I'll click on it and change it from a string to an @reactive and select X. This is an example of setting an attribute which isn't the value attribute of an input element to an @reactive. Now let's go back up to the div, back up to the render, and close everything, and go to the output panel. So let's preview the component. And if you're wondering why I didn't click on Build Component first, it's because clicking on Preview Component builds the component automatically. So let's go down to the updated component. One thing to notice is that the input elements have reset to the initial values of 250. They've also been joined by the number 250 to the right of the range slider and a black circle below the table. If I update either the number box or the range slider, the number to the right of the range slider updates, and the circle moves left and right along the x-axis. Setting @x as a child of the TD element causes the text within the cell to update when x is updated, so we always see the latest value of x within the cell. And setting @x as the value of the CX attribute of the circle element updates the CX property of the circle when x is updated. causing the circle to move along the x-axis. So more generally, including an @reactive in the render section causes that part of the user interface to update whenever the state variable it references updates. And including an @reactive as an input element's value attribute causes the state variable it references to update whenever a user interacts with the input element. This is a fairly simple component, so if we had to create the same thing in HTML and JavaScript, we could do it with just one event handler. But what if we want our users to control the circle's CY and radius properties? Well, let's do that now. Click on Go To, Code, to take us back up to the top of the component editor. So we'll start by adding two new state variables, one for Y and one for radius. Go down to the state section, open it for editing. From its commands, I'll select Add and type Y for the first variable and give it an initial value, number, also 250, and press Enter. And I'll add a second state variable, radius. Press Enter, open nil, select number, and give it a value of 50. And those are all of our state variables. Now if I go down to the render section, we'll update the circle attributes as follows. We'll set CY, change it from 100, click on string, @reactive, and set it to the Y state variable we've just created. And for R, I'll open it, change it from string, @reactive, and set radius. And now let's update the table and add one row for each new state variable. So we'll go back up. We can collapse the SVG element now and open the table instead. The first thing I'm going to do is add a label cell at the start of the row. So to do that, I'll open the TR element, select the first cell, and use the insert command and add an HTML element with the tag of TD and press Enter. And the TD has a default child of an empty string. So I'll click on that to open it, and I'll enter the label X. Now I can go up and close the row and scroll all the way up to the T-body. So I'll start by opening the T-body, and what I'm going to do is collapse the row. Then instead of adding a row for each new state variable, I'll select the row, go to the clipboard, and click on the copy child command. And then I'll click on paste child and paste 2 copies at the end. So I'll click on paste at end and I'll do that again. And I'll go back to edit and I'll also unselect everything. So we'll edit each of the new rows. We'll start with the second row. Everywhere there's an X, we'll replace it with Y. So firstly in the label cell, press Enter. Then in the input number element, then in the input range element, and finally in the last cell of the row. And do the same with the last row, except everywhere we see X, we'll replace it with radius. So firstly in the label cell, then the input number element, and we'll also give it a maximum of 250. Same with the input range element, change it to radius, change its maximum to 250, and finally the last cell of the radius row, we'll change it to radius. And now let's preview the latest component. Go down, click on Preview Component, and now we have a table which lets us set the X and Y position and radius of the circle below. And this is the component we were aiming to create at the very start. The reason I added the controls to update the circle element's CY and radius properties is to demonstrate how quickly we can add controls to an Entmorph component. To create the same thing in HTML and JavaScript, we would need one event handler for each row in the table. We would need to add the event handler to each input element in that row. And we would need each event handler to update the parts of the user interface where we've added @reactives to our Entmorph component. This also means we would have to keep a reference to every element we either want to add an event handler to or update. That's a lot of code with a lot of potential to make mistakes, and this is for a relatively simple component. As our user interface becomes more complex, the HTML and JavaScript version will take considerably longer to develop and maintain. Whereas for the Entmorph component, we just created 3 state variables and added an @reactive to each part of the render section where we want a state variable to update that part of the user interface. I should also point out that it takes me on average around 2 minutes to create this whole component from scratch when I'm not recording a video explaining how Entmorph components work. Now we're in a better position to understand what a component is. Broadly speaking, a component lets us define 3 things: reactive data, a user interface, and how the two interact with each other. Each part of a component that we've looked at so far fits into this model. The state section lets us create reactive data. The render section is where we create our user interface. Setting an @reactive in the render section allows the state variable it references to update that part of the interface. And if we're setting the value attribute of the majority of input elements, it allows the input element to update the state variable it references. State variables are the central mechanism for updating user interfaces in Entmorph, and they provide a declarative approach for building components. Depending on where we place an @reactive in the render section, we're declaring that we want the state variable it references to update an element property, an element child, or that we want an input element to update that state variable. In future videos, we'll look at other uses of @reactives, including dynamically adding and removing CSS classes, rendering special elements, triggering animated effects, and more. We'll also look at more ways to update state variables other than just using input elements. In case you're wondering, Entmorph doesn't use a virtual DOM. Instead, it employs a custom mechanism based on a directed acyclic graph to provide its reactive capabilities. Finally, the code editor that we've been using all this time is itself built using Entmorph components. So that should give you an idea of what Entmorph components are capable of. Although what we've created works well, it looks very dull. So in the next video, we'll look at how to style components using the styles editor available from within the Entmorph component editor. To start using Entmorph now, you can create a free account by going to entmorph.com, clicking on sign up, and submitting your details. You can access more videos on the Entmorph YouTube channel, youtube.com/@entmorph. Please share this video with anyone you think will benefit from using Entmorph. Thanks a lot for watching.